Hi there, and welcome back to the Complicated Kids podcast. I'm your host, Gabriele Nicolet. I am a toddler whisperer, a speech therapist, and a parent coach. And today I am delighted to be joined by Dan Wouri. Dan, welcome.
Thanks, Gabrielle. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, we are going to be talking all about your book, The Daycare Myth. And so let's start there. Why did you write it? What is it about? Tell the good people.
Yeah, well, I have had the good fortune to work in the field of early childhood now for a little over 30 years. It's hard to believe it's been that long, but I began as a kindergarten teacher and worked my way into district administration and was the deputy director of the state of South Carolina's early childhood agency for a number of years. And then most recently have been working with policymakers across the country. I was the founding director of a place called the Hunt Institute in Cary, North Carolina. And the Hunt Institute is Jim Hunt, who was the four-term governor of North Carolina. The institute is a policy resource and education resource to the nation's governors and state lawmakers. And so, both in that work and subsequently here over the past year in my own sort of consulting practice, separate from the Institute, I have been traveling the country and working with state elected leaders around early childhood policy. And so that's sort of where the book came from. A lot of people I think know me best from social media at this point. We can talk about that, but the book is very much a reflection, sort of on my day job in the world of policy. And so, ultimately the book sort of explores what I consider to be a tragic and costly disconnect between what we know from the science of early development and how that is played out in our public policy, or in more cases than not, maybe not well played out in our public policy.
Yeah, and you are singing my song. And part of this has to do with the fact that children have no income and children have they can't even talk, the ones that we're going to be talking about, some of them, and they don't vote. And so it's easy to forget that children become adults and they need to be taken care of properly.
Absolutely. Well, the premise of the book is that we have, we in early childhood, you hear a lot. If you look at the news coverage, you hear constantly about, we have an access crisis and we have an affordability crisis and we have a workforce compensation crisis in early childhood. But, ultimately, I think, all of those are maybe symptoms of a larger crisis, and that is a crisis of understanding that we have, for the better part of 100 years now, thought of daycare, or more recently childcare in our terminology, as being this sort of warm, cozy place that is also, though, very much separate and distinct from education.
Hmm.
And we know very definitively that that is not the case. We know that, not only are children learning from day one, but increasingly we know that they are beginning some of that learning in important ways, even in utero. And so, we have this history that is largely based on parental workforce participation more than it is based in let's make sure that we're optimizing the early development of young children. And so that's where the title, The Daycare Myth, comes from. The myth being that it is its own separate thing that is different from school or from early childhood education.
And when you say learning, because this is interesting, because immediately I think when I hear someone say early childhood learning, I'm immediately suspicious because I'm thinking, do they think that they have to teach those kids the shapes and the colors and the
Yep.
names and the numbers? So could you kind of clarify what you
Yep. Let
mean
me
by,
let me clarify two important terms that and the ways that I am using them. The first is care. I think I'm happy to talk about sort of the some of the developmental premise of the book, but the book sort of defines care as a low bar or too low a bar. Now, in that sense, I'm not talking about nurture, right? I mean, what children need in abundance is, these highly engaged, loving, nurturing interactions. That's not the kind of care I'm talking about. From my work in the policy world, though, I am talking about a vision of care that um, is almost, I mean, it's a crude way to describe it, but it's almost as though we consider these caregiving settings almost like a dog kennel, or a
Yep.
sort of a holding place for children, where they can, where they'll be fed and reasonably safe for 8 hours while their parents go to school, but settings that are mostly based on their basic health and safety rather than the optimization of their development. So that's one thing. And then, to call these environments early learning environments, I think, and you're absolutely right. I've had this conversation with so many people. I think we in the early childhood field who care deeply about young children are very sensitive to the fact that over the years, there has been a tendency to sort of push curriculum down, from the primary grades, what used to be, a first or second grade activity is now happening in kindergarten or even in pre-K. And so there is a real danger in maybe misconstruing the idea that settings for very young children are educational. And I'm certainly not suggesting that they need to be inappropriately academic. Um, but I do think that in the same way that we can sort of consider that, the way that we instruct first graders is very different potentially from the way we instruct graduate students, right? But that we consider both of them, part of the broad umbrella of education.
Mm.
That there's a place for infants and toddlers even under that broad umbrella, and that involves, play and face-to-face interaction, and lots of discovery sorts of learning, as opposed to traditional instruction. So I'm certainly not advocating for kind of a traditional school academic model for young children. But I think to minimize it as something other than education is also to minimize the very important learning and development that happens during those earliest years of life.
It's a fine line, right? When we're in early childhood, the play is learning. It's the same. And if we missed that memo, now we have daycares, warehouses, or dog kennels, as you say, like places for children that now think, oh, well, we better teach them things. And now we're kind of grabbing from up above, from school, pulling down. I was at a preschool the other day. The 4-year-olds had individual desks. I
Hmm.
was appalled. I was absolutely appalled. There was about a quarter of the classroom that was designated as a play space, and the rest was taken up by these desks. And so my kiddo was there wandering the room with his fire truck, knocking stuff off of desks because that was his only place to play.
No.
And talk about that. Yeah.
Well, there are three sort of primary audiences for this book: policymakers,
Mm.
parents, and early childhood professionals. And the book gets into actually, some important lessons for parents. And so maybe I can share two of them. One is that the choice of a preschool setting for your young child is one of the most consequential that you will ever make. And so it is important that you understand that, as parents are choosing these settings, they're not selecting a babysitter, right? They're selecting ultimately the adults who will help to co-construct their child's brain, right? And that's a very different way of looking at things. And so the book includes some guidance for families, actually, who, in terms of what to be looking for
Mm.
in these settings. And you hit on what I would consider a giant red flag, right, for an early childhood program. If you go into a preschool classroom and what you see is a set of desks, run for the hills, right? That is, very much not what you. I shared. I don't know if you saw, Gabrielle. I shared. It's probably been a month or two ago. A wonderful video on social media of a little boy coming out of his very first day of preschool
Mm.
as a 3-year-old, and mom says, "Well, how was your day?" And he said, "I didn't learn anything, and there wasn't enough time to talk about possums." And mom says, "Well, but did you have fun?" And he said, "Yeah," right? So, and I use that as an example, sort of, wearing my former kindergarten teacher hat to say, that I have a very different interpretation than many might about a video like that. That actually is to me, a ringing endorsement of the program that this child is in as a 3-year-old, because if you go into these settings with the expectation that what you're going to see is sort of stereotypical teaching, right? That kids sitting at desks and a teacher standing in the front of the classroom, kind of formally instructing them, that's precisely what you don't want to see
Yeah.
in a preschool. That we know
Well,
that the
sorry, go ahead.
children learn through play, that they learn through discovery, and that there's very rigorous learning that is happening in these classrooms, and it takes very skilled teachers to sort of manage what to the maybe to the untrained eye looks a little bit like chaos, with all of these children sort of working independently,
Yeah.
but that's really where the magic happens.
So there's this weird confluence that I'm just kind of spotting in awareness, which is we've taken very young children, many children who are actually, technically speaking, probably too young developmentally to be in group care, but the needs of the society and the needs of the parents and the working relationship of the economy depends on it, that they be in group care. Okay, fine. So strike one. Number two, we've sort of borrowed this notion that, like, well, if they're going to be in school, they should learn something, and then learning has this very narrow definition. And also, what we know about schooling generally is that most children actually don't learn best when they're being yammered at by a teacher sitting at desks, right? So we know all of this stuff about how brains learn, and yet we're doing this kind of ass backwards in terms of the systems that exist in order to accommodate these populations. So now I'm like, okay, and because I'm a like on the ground with the child kind of person, I hear you saying, okay, you're in policy state, where does that, how do we shift this?
Yeah, I think part of the answer is really what the goal of the book ultimately was, which is that my hope was that it would give us an occasion to take a pause, right? Take a breath, and maybe to question the popular assumptions about how these systems work
Mm-hmm.
and ought to work. That we know, for example, so the book is premised basically on the idea that we should shape our policy around what I call the three simple truths of early development, right? And we already talked about at least one of them, which is that that learning begins in utero and never stops. The second is that this period from prenatal to 3, in particular, is this uniquely consequential window in human development where the fundamental architecture of the brain is wired in ways that, ideally will go on to help support our success in both school and life. And then the third of those is that development is optimized through stable, nurturing, face-to-face interactions with, highly engaged caregivers, and you sort of use those lessons from the brain science to pose questions around how well our system actually lives up to those three simple truths. And it won't probably surprise you to know that I find that the system doesn't stack up particularly well in that regard.
No, and it's a little bit like, winning or losing the lottery. I mean, if you go to any school, really, I call this the special sauce, and it's true of therapists. It's true of anybody who interfaces probably with anybody else. Like, how attuned of a provider are you? How attuned can you be? How are you using, yes, your training, but also then your nervous system in service of these children who are, as you say, developing their brains at an alarmingly rapid rate, to the point where, right, we are co-creating those architectures with them.
That's right.
One of the things, and I'll just pause here to tout your social media presence, because I learn so much from every video that you post, and that is where your videos really, they hit it. They're beautiful at pointing out these elements of attunement, of back and forth, of reciprocal relationship. That is what builds brains, not sitting on the floor and doing a puzzle, although that will do some things. But I would much rather, I mean, just thinking about the clients that I serve who are, have speech and language delays, some of them are autistic, many of them are also have ADHD. They have brains that are diverging from a typical path. The more we can suffuse those brains with positive human interactions, the more regulated those nervous systems become. And now we've got a system that's better able to learn whatever the challenges might be. But the only way we get there is through humans, attaching with humans.
And you're sharing now. I mean, to maybe to use that point as an opportunity to pivot into the policy conversation. We are seeing states all across the country looking at trying to, quote unquote, resolve the childcare crisis through deregulation and through the removal of longstanding student-teacher ratios, for example, and saying, well, the field is in crisis, and maybe they'd be better, they'd be better off financially if we could just take one or two more babies, right, in a classroom. And I always ask people, ask parents to sort of reflect on how time-consuming and how difficult ultimately it is to meet the needs of even a single newborn baby, and then ask them to envision being the parent of quadruplets, right? That which usually draws a gasp, right? And so, but the truth is that in our childcare systems, a ratio of 4 babies to an adult is really sort of our gold standard at this point, right? That's what earns you, among other things, national accreditation for the quality of a program, is that sort of 4-to-1 ratio of babies to caregivers. And so, even that sort of flies in the face of what you just laid out so nicely. This the need for this face-to-face attunement. And so, the idea that, that things are going to get better if maybe we just allow 6 babies per adult instead of, and that, again, sort of harkens back to this question of the daycare myth, right? If the purpose of these settings is ultimately just to make sure that, children are fed and have their diapers changed and are, reasonably intact when their parents come back at the end of the day. That's one proposition. But, if we think of these settings as being learning laboratories, developmental laboratories where we are optimizing, the potential of these little humans, we have to make some very different choices, right? Because children need that social interaction and those reciprocal conversations and the serve and return interactions and all of that, which becomes harder and harder with each additional child.
And I think you've got me going now because soapbox time. If we think for a second that early childhood care is expensive, hard to do, hard to figure out, let's look at the other end of the spectrum when we have even middle school students, high school students, young adults who don't have those skills because they didn't get what they needed in early childhood. Now their brains have gone off path in some regard because of a situation that was not optimized for their growth and development. And now we're talking very, very complicated, expensive systems.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's an entire chapter of the book that sort of lays out this both the long term and the short term economic case around this. And ultimately, I sort of equate the way we are doing business right now to like a payday loan. You're familiar with like in the strip mall, you need to borrow $200 to make it to next Friday, but maybe you have to pay $300 back for the
Yep.
privilege. We are sort of taking out a payday loan at scale on behalf of children. And this is an important message, I think, not only for families of young children, but also for taxpayers who may not have young children in their lives at all right now, which is to say that we are all paying endlessly for the result of our failure to get things right in the first place. We know that high quality early childhood investments, for example, sort of improve all of the things we would hope to improve, right? School achievement outcomes and high school graduations and marital stability and adult income, while at the same time decreasing, a whole host of things that are undesirable, right? That they help to reduce our reliance on social services as adult. They help to improve negative health outcomes. They help to mitigate against interactions with the criminal justice system, for example. And so, we are right now meeting our immediate need at the highest possible long-term cost. There's the question of like pay now or pay later. It's much worse in this case. It really is pay now or pay much more later and for decades to come.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, if people want to buy the book and find out more about you, what should they do?
Well, maybe the easiest way, if you want to find out both about the book and more about me, is I have a website that is just my name, Dan Wouri, WUORI.com. And from there, you can link up with opportunities to purchase the book and to find my social media accounts and much more.
I love it. Thank you for threading this needle between the very serious topic of early childhood development, which happens through play. It is a fine needle to thread, and I'm delighted to watch you do it. So, and thank you for coming on here to talk about it with us.
Well, thank you for the invitation.